Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today we shall be discussing the Asserson report that looks into the BBC's coverage of Israel's war against the genocidal terrorist organisation Hamas in Gaza. And in this program I actually have the privilege and the honour of having the man himself, Trevor Asserson. Warm welcome to the program. You are based predominantly in Israel, but also here in the UK as well. And I just want to say congratulations on such an incredible report that you've published. It's one that I pray that would send shockwaves into the very heart of the BBC establishment.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here.
And Trevor, do you want to share with us your personal story? Share with us your life growing up in the Jewish community in North London.
Well, it might surprise you that I felt that I grew up more in the Christian community than the Jewish community. I was sent to non-Jewish schools where I went to church every morning and attended a Christian assembly. So, that was really the only religion that I was exposed to in my early years. I had a very slight exposure to Judaism, but it was, and many of my closest friends were Christians. Both teachers and also masters at school. So that was a big influence on my life. Later on I came across Orthodox Jews and I began to learn about my own culture, and I became Orthodox myself. But I always felt that it was a very related experience. So I didn't really grow up in the Jewish community in the way that you might have expected. And that was really my background.
Fascinating. And share with us where your passion and love and interest for law developed.
Well, when I was studying, I went to Oxford University where I studied history. And as part of the course, I actually had to look at an 18th century human rights story, a parliamentarian called John Wilkes. His statue is actually outside the Royal Courts of Justice in Fetter Lane to this day. And as a part of that, I had to read some law cases, much shorter than the ones today, of just a few pages. And I just realized this was a fascinating area where simply through the legal process, one can have a massive effect with a relatively small amount of effort, because the lawyers and the independent judges can actually change society, and they do. And this is the England that we live in today, with the freedoms that we've come to get used to and take for granted, are really very much the result of judicial decisions, brave judicial decisions throughout English history.
Incredible. And share what it was like to be actually Jewish on campus at Oxford University,
Right.
One of our elite, prestigious universities. Many would actually say Oxford is the most prestigious, but I think those who have attended Cambridge University might disagree on that one.
I think that there are a lot of very good universities in England. Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, LSE, there's a number, and I don't think any of them has a particular monopoly on that. But I was very lucky to be there. As I said, during that period, I still hadn't really, I learned about Judaism only towards the end of my time at Oxford. And of course, during that period, it was not really a difficult thing to be a Jewish student. There was no groups attacking Jews just for being Jewish, or even for being Zionist. It wasn't a problem. It was simply another group of people with their own particular identity. And I know, because we hire a lot of students in the law firm that I now run. Those students are having a horrible time in university now. They really feel persecuted in a way that I never had at all. I was just another regular member of the college.
And Trevor, talk about how you were called to the Israeli bar in 1992, and understanding that so much of Israeli law is actually based on British law because of the Mandate years.
Well, during the Mandate, the British basically said, where there's a lacuna, where there's a gap, let's just have English law. So English law became the law of Israel to some extent. And then when the British left, the Israeli government said, well, any law which is in place today will continue to be the law until it gets changed. So the net result is, as you say, the foundation of Israeli law was English law, but there's been 75 plus years of change since then. So although it's recognizably similar, the two legal systems do diverge. In terms of my own career as an Israeli lawyer, I very much wanted to live in Israel. I didn't know how I could go about that. And I therefore qualified as an Israeli lawyer. It was relatively easy to do so. You could get the qualification without too great a knowledge of either law or history or language if you were already qualified for more than 5 years in another country. Actually practicing as an Israeli lawyer was a different matter, and whilst I was able to do my training contract, I didn't really see that I had a successful career ahead of me as an Israeli lawyer, so I actually went back to England after I qualified.
So what made you decide to make that big step and make Aliyah to Israel and to become an Israeli, live in Israel, but also then set up a law firm in Israel where you're based in Tel Aviv now?
The principal thing was that I was brought up, as I said, not really very involved in the Jewish community, and I felt myself to be very much a member of the majority within English society. I was just a regular guy. And then I suddenly, for my own reasons, found myself in a minority. And I didn't like being a minority. I'm not claiming persecution. I mean, England has been amazingly good to the Jewish community. But I had an ambition to have children, and I wanted them to grow up feeling they were part of the majority. The only country in the world where Jews can be part of the dominant local culture is actually in Israel. So it was my ambition to live in Israel. I married someone who went to live in Israel when she was 20. So she was obviously at home in Israel, and that's where really what the drive came from that, with a lot of support from the family.
Amazing. And just share with us why you wanted to confront the BBC by setting up BBC Watch, primarily examining its coverage of Israel and conflicts against Palestinian terror organisations that Israel has been involved in, sadly, for decades.
Right. Well, I actually worked initially at a law firm called Herbert Smith, which was a major litigation law firm. And then spent 7 years as a human rights lawyer for a legal aid firm before going to Israel. And I always felt law is a tool which you can use to take on battles and to right wrongs. Not always successful, but it's there. That's the main tool that one has. So I was always motivated by that. When I was at Herbert Smith, I was asked to join a group of lawyers who were representing two major politicians in England at the time, Sir David Owen and Sir David Steele, who sued the BBC because they believed they were not being properly treated by the BBC. Now, that is public record, so I'm not revealing any secrets there, but I learned the technique of how you sue the BBC during that experience. And as a result, when the second Intifada broke out, and I could see that the BBC was getting the story very, very badly wrong, I thought, well, how can I be sure? Let's hire a student, get them to watch television and radio, write it all down, then look at it and see if the BBC's getting the story right or wrong. And I produced a report, and that report went viral, and I then produced a few more, and I became to some extent known for my work in looking at the BBC compliance with its obligations, or failure to comply with its obligations. So when this present war with Hamas broke out, I wasn't that surprised to be approached by one client, the CAA, that asked me to look at the Al-Ahli hospital disaster. That was, I'm sure many of your viewers will know, was a hospital where the BBC, along with other journalists, said that the hospital had been deliberately attacked by Israel, the buildings had been destroyed, and 500 people had been killed. Now, there was nothing in that report which was correct. The number of people killed was possibly 100, a great tragedy, but it wasn't 500. The hospital had not been hit. The car park of the hospital had been hit. It wasn't by Israel, it was by Islamic Jihad, which is a Hamas affiliate. So that was a wonderful example of the BBC getting the story absolutely upside down. And I was asked to look to see whether we could sue the BBC in relation to that. What I concluded was the only way we could do it was by really analysing not a single error, because the BBC did say that they made mistakes, although they never actually apologised and never withdrew their story, but was by exploring what I'd done before, exploring their output over a period of time and then analysing it.
Yeah, so before we go on to the more details of your extraordinary factual and detailed report, Trevor, if we talk a little bit about the Second Intifada, because it was the BBC's coverage of the Second Intifada, what also comes to mind is the so-called Jenin massacre, where the BBC reported that there were multiple casualties killed by the Israelis, and that turned out to be false. Again, relying on their kind of Palestinian runners for information, running the story without proper fact-checking first, and then coming to conclusions where then Israel is demonized around the world for committing a massacre that Israel never committed. And of course, this then leads to a huge rise of Jew hatred. But share with us your thoughts on the BBC's own inquiry, known as the Abelian Inquiry, that was set up in 2004 as an independent inquiry to look at the BBC's coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly the Second Intifada, and how the BBC has spent over £350,000 of the UK taxpayers to keep this report hidden from the public.
I'll just add one point to the story you just talked about in Jenin. The actual story was that that people were lined up against a wall with their hands tied behind their back and executed in cold blood. That was the story, a total invention and a total fiction. And yet the BBC rushed to tell that story. And I'm giving you that detail because they've almost identically repeated the story of mass executions of Palestinians, again, during the period that I was looking. And it's not so much the fact they get the story wrong, it's the enthusiasm with which, when they hear anything that detracts from Israel, there seems to be amongst many of their journalists a huge enthusiasm to try and report on that, to magnify it and to tell it over and over again. And the apology, when it comes, is usually hidden in some page of BBC corrections that almost no one even knows exists. But you asked a question, which I've now...
of course, the famous Abelian report,
the Abelian report.
That the BBC refused to actually public.
What the BBC does is it tries to often defend itself by hiding behind reports that it commissions from its own people. And when I started doing my reports in the Second Intifada, Malcolm Bailyn was appointed, and he met me and he told me that he'd been appointed to some significant degree because of my work.
That's a big compliment.
Well, it was a bit of a compliment. And he told me that he expected his report to be published. But of course, when he discovered, and even though he was a BBC man, and he was obviously expected to whitewash the BBC, when he didn't, when he actually blamed the BBC, found the BBC to be anti-Israel, his report was buried. So you'll ask, how is it that I know that the report actually finds that the BBC is anti-Israel? And that's because a very senior person in the BBC at the time was able to look at it and subsequently met me, and he was able to tell me that it was actually, it made anti-Israel findings. But it was hidden, as you say. They went all the way up to the Supreme Court twice to try and make sure that no one would ever see no one would ever see that report. It's 20 years old now, so it's an old story. The only difference between then and now is, rather than learn the lesson, they're, in my view, much worse than they were then.
So let's take you back to almost a year to the horrific events of October the 7th, the biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel's history, the biggest massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust over 80 years ago during the Second World War. Where were you on October the 7th, and when did you first become aware of what was happening, knowing that it happened on a Shabbat, but it was also Simchat Torah, which is a Jewish holiday?
Well, because I'm Orthodox, and Orthodox Jews don't use telephones or television or radio don't use electricity on the Sabbath. So initially, we obviously weren't aware of what was going on. The one thing we do have is on our phones, we have an alarm system that tells whenever a missile is being fired into Israel. And that system overrides even being turned off. And suddenly we heard 600 or 700 signals coming one after another of a huge missile attack. So we found out very early in the morning that there was something dramatic going on. And initially we couldn't understand what was happening, but we realized it was this alarm. I have a son-in-law who's in the army, and two soldiers who live with us. They've originally English, and they come to Israel to join the army and to become Israeli citizens and do their military service. And we had put them up. Within a few hours, they had been called up, and they were on their way to one to the north and one to the south. And so I was aware of what was going on at a very, very early stage, simply because as soon as we knew the rocket attack was going on, we advised them that they had to turn their phones on, and as soon as their phones were on, they were being called, and they were putting their uniforms on and going off to war. And one of them saw action that afternoon in a really, terrible attack. And in Be'eri, one of the kibbutzim which had been attacked, and although they have very, very tough training, he said that he'd never seen anything remotely like he'd never been trained or expected to see anything remotely like what he saw. It was a truly, truly horrific sight.
Yeah, and having visited kibbutz near Oz and seen the devastation caused by Hamas on October the 7th, I don't think any of the our Western media coverage really showed the true magnitude and the scale of October the 7th. And the fact is, the new reports come out that there were 7,000 people involved in residents of Gaza, but also about 4,000 Hamas terrorists, even more, that were part of that horrific attack on October the 7th. But what is your thoughts on October the 7th and the massacre that unfolded on that day?
I think it's probably the most brutal massacre that has ever been seen, because it was filmed by the perpetrators in a heroic sort of way as they were doing it. They were, and the level of brutality was extraordinary. They were, burning people alive, tying people together and torturing them, and then burning them alive. There were obviously sexual assaults, horrific rapes, there were body mutilations. They were all aiming at civilians. It was every law of war that has ever been written, more or less, was being breached by Hamas, and it was just horrific, both in its size and in what they did. Everyone knows that 1,200 people died, many of them in the most horrific way. But there were also more than that who were injured, who were people who were just shot at and killed or injured while they were trying to have a party or just living their normal life. And it was also horrific that Israel has constantly tried to make peace with Gaza. So one of the things is that one of the features of that is allowing the people of Gaza to come and work in Israel. Many of them had jobs as gardeners or plumbers or builders in the local area, and they were using their ability to enter Israel to get a living, to scout around and to take detailed facts so that they knew exactly who to attack, they knew exactly where to go, they knew exactly who was living where, and they were essentially spying out the land in order to attack it and betraying the friendship and faith and trust that had been placed in them by Israel.
Absolutely, and particularly the peace-loving southern Israelis that are close to the Gaza Strip, to actually allow between 13 and 17,000 residents of Gaza to live and work in Israel. to improve their standard of living and to bring about peace and cooperation. Sadly, they paid a very high price for that on October the 7th. Now, but back to your report. So you published the Asserson report last week. It was then carried as an exclusive by the Sunday Telegraph. And the report is entitled here, for our viewers, can actually download a copy of the Asserson report. You can see it there. So it's called the Executive Summary of the Asserson Report, the Israel-Hamas War and the BBC, by Trevor Asserson himself. And according to your notes here, you did an extensive research into the TV news, radio, social media and BBC Arabic, and the time frame on this was one from October the 7th, 2023 until the 7th of February 2024 that covered a total of 4 months and 124 days. Show us, you talked about before producing previous reports, but how important was it that you produced the Asserson report, particularly on the BBC's coverage of October the 7th and the aftermath?
Right. Well, this report is different in terms of scope. Previously, I had, I said, hired a student for a few weeks to do some work. On this particular occasion, because I couldn't really stop myself, I realised the first problem you have with looking at the BBC's output is actually collecting the output, and I got someone to write a very simple program that was able to scrape the material from the web and retain it, so because normally it just disappears. Before I knew where I got to, we'd done 4 months worth of programs, and that turned out to be about 9 million words. Now, I've also put together a small group of people who were external lawyers and internal lawyers within my firm to analyse and read that material to see what it was like. Now, what I thought was going to be a couple of weeks' work turned into about 7 months' work of reading, because I didn't realise I had 9 million words of news coverage. It's only news coverage, only on this topic. There were certain key words that triggered what we recorded and what we didn't. And we were doing it in Arabic as well, which only added to the size of the task. I was very lucky that a newspaper article was written about what I was doing, and that was written in English and in Hebrew. And as a result of the Hebrew version, a team of data scientists, Israeli data scientists from Hebrew University, Bar-Ilan University, and some top universities here in the UK, approached me. And the leader of that team was Hanan Shani-Narkis, Dr. Hanan Shani-Narkis, who has an astonishing energy and devotion to this. So what he did was he put together this team. In the report we say it's about 20 people. I think at times it was much bigger. And they also very motivated to check on the truth of this and developed whole programs, whole experiments, whole systems which are really cutting edge. I think really a totally new way of looking at media and media analysis, and used large data to look at the material that we'd collected in totally new ways. At the same time, I was running the legal team, as I said, both in my office and external, to use traditional forensic methods. I'm a litigation lawyer, and that's the system we use. So in parallel, you've got two completely separate systems. I think that the two of them complement one another because they're two disciplines, two different teams, both moving along two different roads, and they both ended up at the same destination. We both came up with very, very similar results. So each of them actually strengthens the other. I'm explaining this in detail because the BBC's knee-jerk reaction within about 24 hours of getting the report was to say they have questions about the methodology, trying to undermine it. There's nothing about the methodology, which is traditional litigation method. I've used it before many times, and I think it's an entirely robust, perfectly good methodology. In addition, it's strengthened by a totally new methodology, which is sitting alongside, and you'll find both of them in the report.
Which is incredible. Also the use of AI technology to actually then determine some of the words that were said and the reports to actually find out the kind of biased nature of the BBC's coverage. So if we actually break down some of your findings in your report, Trevor, so you initially found that the BBC had breached its own editorial guidelines. Listen to this: 1,553 times of its coverage of Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. Show us the true extent of the bias that your report shows that the BBC has towards Israel.
Right. Well, I know that Douglas Murray was interviewed and asked this question, and he said he's surprised it's so few. And he's right. The truth is that 1,500 is a number which I could verify, I can show where that comes from, but the true number is much larger. Let me give you an example. Every time that the BBC reports someone from Gaza, they're reporting somebody who is working from a place of reporting restrictions. They do that several times a day, and their own charter, their own guidelines say they must tell the audience that there are reporting restrictions. Hamas is a dictatorship. It uses violence to intimidate journalists, and there's many reports of people who've come out of Gaza and explained that they work under massive reporting restrictions. If Hamas does not like what they say, they don't say it, or they get thrown out. If they're locals, things even worse than that might happen to them. Secondly, most of the people that are reporting are Hamas affiliated, Hamas supporters, possibly even Hamas members. I've shown in the report that we've analysed approximately 67 such people who have affiliations and possibly membership of Hamas. Again, the BBC has an absolutely clear obligation to tell the audience every time they do that. Again, probably several times a day. And thirdly, the information they give is particularly where they're talking about the deaths, the number of deaths, and it's the absolutely clear strategy of Hamas that they want to get the world on their side by saying Israel's killed lots of civilians. Now, it's obviously tragic that civilians have died, but what we do know from lots of independent studies by professors and various organizations, those figures are not true. They are definitely inaccurate. One study showed that one poor individual suffered the indignity of dying 9 or 10 times. Now, obviously,
is that even possible?
That's tragic. It's tragic that he's died, if he did. But it's clearly a lie that he died 9 or 10 times. It's clearly a lie that Israel is responsible for the 500 people in the Al-Ahli hospital, but that 500 people is in the numbers. And so the BBC breaches its own regulations because there are very clear regulations about reporting deaths in a war zone, particularly where they can't corroborate and the information comes from someone who has an interest, which is the case here. So just by reporting the number of deaths, they are probably breaching at least 4 or 5 breaches of their own regulations. And so that's why I say the number of 1,500 is much too low. It's probably many thousands, many more thousands, because they're breaching many regulations every single day. I
mean, come on, we're dealing with here some of the kind of top professional journalists in the country that work for the BBC, and we know that the BBC is, it's the national broadcaster. It's funded by the licence fee, meaning that mine and your taxes go into funding the BBC, so they are also under scrutiny by the British government. And the question is, why have they breached their own guidelines? I mean, it comes down to kind of basic journalism, doesn't it? That you are there to report the facts and not to make impartial reports. And instead here, they're breaching their own guidelines. Surely, and breaking every rule in the book to present Israel in a bad light.
Correct, they are. And that is what they've been doing, in my view. So the question is fundamentally, how's that happened? And I think that there are two elements to this. There's an institutional bias that seems to have developed within the BBC. What I don't think is happening, I don't think there is a senior journalist or governor of the BBC saying, let's attack Israel. That I don't believe is happening. What I think is happening is that a lot of journalists who very much dislike Israel for whatever reasons it may be, maybe they don't dislike Israel, but that's what they report. They report a very negative view of Israel, have been left entirely uncontrolled by the management. So at the foundation, and this is perhaps, the report makes lots of extraordinary findings that BBC Arabic is possibly similar to Al Jazeera in terms of its position on Israel. It's a very extreme paper. But the really foundational problem, I think, is that the BBC has lost control of its own product. It has, for instance, I know how many interviewees the BBC's interviewed over the 4 months that I looked at, which is a third of a year. It's quite a lot of coverage. I know how many were pro-Israel, how many were anti-Israel. I know how many were civilians and how many were authoritarian figures like soldiers. I've done that analysis. The BBC has not got a clue. It does not do any analysis. I know what percentage of the stories are sympathetic to Israel and how much are sympathetic to Palestinians. Obviously, figures like 100-0 don't sound like balance to me, but the BBC does have editorial license to choose a number to say, let's make 70% in this direction and 25% in that direction, 30% in that direction. They can do that, but they ought to decide at a senior editorial level what is it they're trying to do and then monitor doing it. They have no rules at all. So what you've got is no idea of what they've actually recorded, no idea what they've reported, no idea what they're going to report next week, and they've got no idea of targets of what they're trying to achieve. Now, if you think about it, they are a £4 billion a year organisation. That's just the money they get from the British people. They get more income than that. And they've got one fundamental rule: be impartial. So you would think that they would have some management controls in place to try and make sure that they at least achieve that fundamental aim, because that's the deal they have with the British people. You give us your money, we will give you impartial reporting. They have no tools whatsoever. So the journalists are left uncontrolled, and the BBC simply has no control over what those journalists are doing. That is the fundamental problem, I believe, and it's a very, very systemic problem within the BBC, which really needs to be tackled at a very deep level.
But aren't with your report and your incredible analysis of the BBC and its coverage of Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, firstly, we have to say that the Israelis do not want to be in Gaza. It was only because after the horrific massacre of October the 7th that Israel had no choice but to launch a military incursion into Gaza to destroy Hamas. Hamas use asymmetrical warfare. They hide behind women and children. They use their headquarters in hospitals. This is widely reported through the IDF. But the danger is that the BBC is then taking the Hamas narrative. And the danger is that this is designed to demonize Israel so that it erodes Israel's moral standing in the world and Israel's ability to defend herself and her citizens. But also what it does as well, sadly, is it inflames Jew hatred in this country and around the world. So the consequences of getting this reporting wrong, as you have given so many examples in your report, is very dangerous, not only for the future security of Israel, but also for the Jewish community as well, isn't it?
I think it is very dangerous. I think that the BBC, amongst other things, apart from its contractual obligations, its charter obligations, it ought to have a responsibility to give proper reporting. And as you said, they've made the story one type of story. The whole story is simply how many children, how many women have died. Now, the death of women and children is tragic. No one is suggesting that isn't tragic, but that needs to be told within a context. The BBC guidelines say that no significant story should be omitted or underrepresented. That's a very fundamental guideline. So I've spent quite a bit of the report looking at what they haven't told you, what they haven't told anyone. one of the stories is you correctly say that there's a war in Gaza, but actually Israel's being attacked by from 7 different locations, from 5 countries and the West Bank and Gaza that are not independent countries, but they are autonomous zones. And you've got Syria, you've got Yemen, you've got Iran, you've got Iraq. All of these places have also been attacking Israel simultaneously, and in the West Bank, of course, funded by Iran and Qatar. So Israel is facing an extraordinary array of enemies attacking it with missiles, money, and stirring up terrorism on all fronts. It's really an existential war for Israel. It's lost territory in the north and the south of the country. Again, a story that simply isn't told by the BBC. It's facing implacable enemies that do not want a deal, whose raison d'etre is, according to their charter, which again, the charter is a fundamental document for Hamas, and it says, kill Jews, destroy Israel. That's what they exist for. And that's, again, a story not even told. And another story which isn't even told by the BBC is this needs to be, I think, examined. Israel has no territorial aims at all in this war. It's not trying to invade Lebanon, which is firing thousands of missiles into Israel every day. It's not trying to invade Gaza. It left Gaza. Israel left Lebanon. It does not have any territorial aims. It's fighting an entirely defensive war that it does not want to have. It doesn't want war. And it was thrust into this position against its will. A story that is not told. So all that's told is death of civilians. That number, tragic, whatever the correct number is, it's tragic, but it's a lie. They should try and tell you that it's a lie. They should try and tell you the correct numbers. And the BBC also really has a responsibility to explain that one of the reasons, and probably the only reason, that civilians are dying is because they're being used as human shields by Hamas, which again is a war crime. And it makes, when there is a military installation, as there was in Al-Shifa hospital, for example, it makes the hospital a legitimate military target. It was a huge military headquarters. It was a legitimate target under the rules of law. The fact that civilians were killed, Israel goes to enormous lengths to avoid, as I'm sure that you've recorded before, but the BBC doesn't record that. The BBC does not tell that story. So it can tell the story of the tragedy that's occurring to the Gazan people, but it also ought to say that's very, very largely at the door of Hamas. And for all the reasons I've just explained, that story is not told by the BBC, and that's a breach of their own obligations.
No, absolutely. And the other aspect you bring out of this report is very important, and that is the description of Islamist terrorist organisations, whether they're Hezbollah or whether they're Hamas. And the BBC likes to call them militants, gunmen. And I heard one BBC report on Radio 5 Live where they're interviewing an expert on Hezbollah, and they referred to Hezbollah not as an Islamist genocidal terrorist organisation, but as a group. So it makes you think: is this a group of friends? Is this a rock band or a pop band? Yeah. And and the use of language also then affects how people receive those reports. If you label an organisation, a group, as it were, they have used occasionally, and they picked up on this, that the British government refers to Hamas as a prescribed terror organisation, but that only came when there was huge pressure placed on the British government to do so. So share with us how the choice of language in describing terror organisations is also false and inaccurate and dangerous.
Well, let's first of all talk about the sheer hypocrisy of the BBC, because when certain things happen around the world that are clearly terrorist attacks, the BBC rushes to call them terrorist attacks, and I've recorded some of those examples in the report. They have no problem whatsoever using the word terrorist. In fact, sometimes they use it before they know who's perpetrated the attack. So they can't know the motive, and they can't therefore correctly call them terrorists they do turn out to be terrorists. But the BBC is very, very free with the word terrorist, except when attacking Israelis. That's the big exception for them, for some reason. Now, as you correctly say, the BBC came under such pressure for failing to refer to these terrorists, the terrorist attack of the 7th of October, as a terrorist attack, that eventually they agreed to refer to Hamas as a proscribed terrorist organization. Now, what that means is that the Terrorism Act, which defines what a terrorist is, was passed, and it has a legal system by which the government can look at the facts and prescribe an organization, define it as a terrorist organization. That system is subject to challenge. Somebody could say, no, we're not, and they could appeal. There has been no appeal of that. It's a fact. It's unarguable. And the BBC eventually said, well, we'll describe Hamas as a prescribed terrorist organization. They actually use that description about 50% of the times as they use the description a health ministry. So they were more likely, as a member of the audience, to pick up the concept that there's some kind of version of the NHS than as a terrorist organization. It's farcical, really, the way they've done it. I think we counted something like 3% or 7% of the times that the BBC...
I can tell you the exact figures. According to your report, the BBC identified Hamas as being a described or designed or recognised terror organisation just 409 times out of 12,459 times, and that represents 3.2% for that 4-month period. There we go. We've got the facts and the figures here. But also want to share something as well. So in your report, you state that Hamas members filmed and publicised themselves committing acts which appeared to constitute as war crimes. The report goes on to say that including taking of hostages, willful killings of murder, and the report's analysis of the BBC coverage found that Israel was associated with war crimes 4 times more than that of Hamas, 127 times compared to 30, with genocide 14 times more and 283 times versus 19 times, and within breaching international law 6 times more, 167 versus 27. So share with us how the BBC, according to your report, is trying to change the narrative, trying to change the facts on the ground, that it's Israel committing genocide and not Hamas, which they did on October the 7th.
Yeah, well, this is just one of the many facts in the report, which if it weren't so tragic, it would be amusing to see the absurdity of the graphs. Here we have an organisation which was filming and boasting about its breaches of international law, its war crimes, filming and boasting about the fact it's targeted civilians, etc., used rape and torture, and of course it's taken hostages, which is also a war crime. So, and there's no question factually that they've done all these things because, as I said, they filmed it, boasted about it, and there are hostage release negotiations because they accept they're holding hostages. So there's no factual debate there. The principal allegations against Israel, none of which are anywhere close to being proved, and indeed even the court that was asked to rule on this, the president of the court said, I have not made any findings that there's been any breach of international law by Israel. They are much, much more complicated to show. Very, very difficult to demonstrate. For example, there's an allegation that there's been collective punishment. What's the collective punishment? Israel said to all of the people of Gaza, please leave military areas, and here are the military areas. They sent literally millions of phone calls, text messages, dropped leaflets. They made every possible effort to tell the population to leave an area that was a legitimate military target, and they then attacked those targets. That was considered to be a war crime, to tell these people to try and avoid being killed in a war. The other war crime that is alleged is that they have starved people to death. Now, the BBC, by withholding aid, actually the aid is being released by Israel faster than the aid agencies can distribute it. The aid agencies themselves know and record, and there's plenty of evidence that the aid isn't reaching its destination because it's being stolen by Hamas and then sold on the black market back to the people who are meant to be getting it so that Hamas can fund its own war effort. This, of course, isn't told by the BBC, but you can see that that's a very specious allegation of war crime, that there's vast amounts of food being provided, tragic though the situation is for Gazans. But the idea that there's a genocide because they're being starved to death is I think absurd. So absurd that the BBC has come up with two pictures, accounts of children who starved to death. One of them, it turned out, was a child that died in Syria in the Syrian civil war a few years ago, a completely fake picture. And the other was a child that it turned out, although they said they were dying of starvation, an investigative reporter, David Collier, did a close examination.
Excellent guy, David Collier, yeah.
And he found that the child was dying from cystic fibrosis, I think, or another disease which was nothing to do with starvation. And that the BBC is so desperate to get this across that they're creating fake news, literally fake news, in order to try and create a story that doesn't exist. So under these circumstances, where one side is, in my view, clearly guilty of war crimes, the other side is accused of, clearly got very, very good defences and almost certainly, in my view, not committing them, that Israel is accused 6-1 times by the BBC of war crimes compared to the number of times Hamas. That's typical, I would say, of the BBC. They've got everything upside down, and it's out there desperate to report, as you said, to create a negative story of Israel, which is.
And I can't tell you how many news reports I've watched on the BBC where they've done a feature about countering fake news, and that they are the guardians of truth, that they are the guardians of impartiality. But
I'll give you one other example, which is really quite amusing. They wanted to talk about it. It is appalling that there are attacks by some Jews on Palestinians in the West Bank, and they shouldn't be happening. They should be stamped out, and they're not adequately stamped out. So I have no truck with that whatsoever. But in order to demonstrate this, they put a picture of an Orthodox Jew walking through a field holding a gun. Now, that was to show these violent Jews in the West Bank. So I looked at the picture. I could immediately see this picture looked strange. I won't go into the details of why, so I asked some people in my team to research it. It turns out this is a picture of somebody 24 years ago who was coming back from a funeral at which his closest friend had been killed by Palestinians, and the yeshiva where he was studying had been burned to the ground by Palestinians. And this poor fellow, whose world had been destroyed, whose best friend he'd just come back from the funeral of, he was being depicted as a violent Jew attacking Palestinians. It was an entirely fake story. The story may not have been fake, but the picture was an entirely fake picture. And it was upside down again. And the BBC, one has to ask oneself, what is it that gets the BBC so desperate to tell a story that they will go back into their archives 24 years to pick up a picture in order to illustrate it?
Well, we need the BBC management to answer that question.
That.
Absolutely. Yeah. But one of the most disturbing aspects of your report, I found, Trevor, was the way that BBC Arabic covers the war in Gaza. And literally this is beyond the pale. So I'm just going to read out an extract of your report, which will shock our viewers. It says here, the report states the following, that between teams were able to identify 68 individuals who were either members of Hamas or had posted on social media in support of terrorism against Jews, including celebrating the 7th of October 2023. So the big question is, why has or is the BBC literally employing members of Hamas as journalists to report for BBC Arabic, which in your report is by far the worst of any other media network around the world of its coverage of Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza.
I think it's a total disgrace that these people are being employed. It really is outrageous. And I know from having spoken with some journalists in the BBC that the BBC is aware of the backgrounds of some of the people that they are either interviewing or taking news feed from. They know that they're affiliated to Hamas or possibly even Hamas members. Some of them they may be unaware, but that's their obligation to check these people out.
Absolutely.
And it really is using the BBC and particularly BBC Arabic as a platform for terrorism. And let me give you some examples. If you look at the report, you'll see that on the 7th of October, the day that the attack was taking place, the BBC was filming and was broadcasting a Hamas promotional video with Hamas's logo on it, and set it to music. Now, we found it elsewhere to different music, so we think that the BBC actually chose their own music to dramatic, romanticized sort of vision of heroic fighters. And they're literally a platform for Hamas. Now, when we did an analysis, and this I think was one of the more remarkable experiments carried out by the data scientists team, they decided to look at a huge data set of all English language news outlets in the world. And they compared the BBC Arabic and BBC English with the output of all of those other media organisations. And extraordinarily, the BBC English came out as pretty extreme compared with others. And BBC Arabic's partners, the company that it keeps, these are newspapers that I haven't read, so forgive me, I'm just making an assumption that the Iran Times and the Times of Egypt and the Times of Pakistan are pretty extreme newspapers. Iran is funding and organising this entire campaign against Israel. And Al Jazeera, we know not to be the most pro-Israel outlet. This is where the BBC Arabic sits. They are the Al Jazeera of the UK. And that is not a correct place for them to be, and is not a correct place for the British public to be paying £4 billion in order to be able to produce an Al Jazeera with a BBC brand on it.
But Trevor, isn't this a kind of national security threat? Because Hamas represent the same ideology as that of the Iranian regime. I know that they're Sunni and the Iranian regime is Shia, but they still want to export the Islamic revolution around the world. Yeah. They want to destroy Israel. They want to set up an Islamic caliphate and effectively have an Islamist worldview of total world domination. And we see that the BBC has actually employed, according to your report, members of Hamas. The big question is, are they still employing them after October the 7th? But this is a kind of a moral equivalency of employing Nazi Germany's in the 1930s to report on the news from Nazi Germany from a Nazi German perspective, because Hamas's ideology is that infusion of Nazism with Islamism. Which is genocide against the Jewish people at the very core of its ideology, the same as Nazism. So surely this raises serious questions regarding national security issues as it relates to Israel and the ideology of Hamas, and actually employing members of Hamas. Yeah. Surely this is something that our security services should be very aware of and very concerned about.
You raise a point which hasn't been raised to me before, but I think it's quite right. By the way, the report analyses those people who have been used by the BBC since the 7th of October. So they certainly are still being used by the BBC, or were in the 4 months, third of a year that we looked at. Not only are they exporting these horrific ideals across the world with the BBC brand on them, but they're exporting them in Arabic to all the Arabic speakers in England, whose radicalism is being further increased and encouraged by the BBC in the UK if they are tuned into BBC Arabic. I think it's it really is a massive management failure. It's a complete disgrace. The British public ought to be up in arms that their money is being spent on this kind of Islamist propaganda, which is not what the BBC is about. I am in favour of free speech. I have no problem, so long as it doesn't tip over into hate speech, for people to have a different ideology to mine and to be able to express it. I do have a problem with the BBC expressing it.
Two things I want to add before we come to the end of this programme, and this is also what you mentioned in your report. You mentioned that the BBC failed to mention the Hamas Covenant Charter that calls for the destruction against Israel and the eradication of the Jewish people worldwide. The BBC failed to report that the leader of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon congratulated Hamas on their victory on October the 7th. The BBC failed to identify Hamas as a dictatorship. The BBC failed to explain military threats to Israel, especially from the Iranian regime. The BBC, according to the report, failed to fully report on the hostage ordeal, especially the sexual violence directed at the Israeli hostages. But I just want to read, before we go, the response that the BBC gave to the Sunday Telegraph. They said, "We have serious questions about the methodology of this report, particularly its heavy reliance on AI to analyse impartiality and its interpretation of BBC's editorial guidelines. We don't think coverage can be assessed solely by counting particular words divorced from context. We are required to achieve due impartiality rather than the balance of sympathy proposed in the report. We believe our knowledgeable and dedicated correspondents are achieving this, despite the highly complex and challenging, polarising nature of the conflict. However, we consider the report carefully and respond directly to the authors once they've had time to study in detail."
Well, you've been very fair to the BBC to read out their diatribe, really, which is clearly based upon not having yet read the report, because I don't rely on the AI. The AI merely strengthens the output by bringing, as I said, taking a different discipline by a different road and reaching the same conclusion. The majority of the report is based upon traditional forensic approaches. So I do think what the report shows is a fundamental systemic breach by the BBC, and I think that what's happened is that individual journalists, some of whom clearly have a message that they're trying to get across personally about their own personal aims and ambitions and dislikes and likes, and the BBC's rules say they're not allowed to express their personal views, they're out of control. And that is what is a fundamental problem.
Trevor, within 20 seconds, how can our viewers respond to your report?
Well, before you started recording, with a very moving prayer. And I think we should all be joining in prayer to believe that we have a true God looking over us, and he will help and guide us all to solve what is a fundamental problem within British society in correcting the BBC's bias.
Amen. Trevor, it's been an absolute pleasure to host you on the Middle East Report today, and I want to thank you for watching this programme at home. I encourage you all to actually read Trevor Asserson's report to see the extent of the BBC bias, and please